Welcome to the Yiddish Radio Project. I'm Scott Simon.
WEVD, New York.
WLPH, Brooklyn, New York.
WCNW, operating on a frequency of 1,500 kilocycles.
It all began one day in 1985 when musician and social historian Henry Sapoznik literally tripped over some ancient records in a dusty and cluttered storage room in New York City. They were transcriptions of old radio programs, extra-large aluminum discs made at the time of broadcast. On the faded labels, Sapoznik could make out station call letters, Hebrew writing, and program titles. He paid just a few dollars for the records, searched for the right contraption on which to play them, and then he sat down to listen.
From atop the Lowe State Theater building, your American Jewish Hour. The B. Manischewitz Company, world's largest matzah bakers, happily present Yiddish Melodies in Swing.
This was Yiddish Radio, programs produced by and about the Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe who came to America at the turn of the last century and settled in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and on the Lower East Side of Manhattan.
And now, Maestro Sam Medoff and the lads of the Yiddish Swing Tet bring us the rollicking rhythms of Dayenu.
Henry Sapoznik spent the next 17 years scouring the country for more of these recordings. He's rescued more than 1,000 discs in all, over 500 hours of material, and he has collaborated with producers Dave Isay and Yair Reiner to create this series. The programs you'll be hearing are in both English and Yiddish, but the themes are universal. These recordings allow us to go back in time to eavesdrop on a lost world. We begin our tour with a history of Yiddish radio and this project from Henry Sapoznik.
I'm Henry Sapoznik, and this is my mother.
Hello, Henry.
My mother was born in Poland and was 21 when the Nazis invaded.
It's a long story, but thank God we survived and we came to America in 1949. My father had a sister. She took us to her house, but it wasn't the same. We wanted to be on our own. So one day my husband got dressed up and he walks, he looks around. A man comes and he looks like a Jewish man. So he stops him. He said, we just came to America. I have a wife and a child and we need an apartment. He looked him over, said, come with me. And he showed him, this is an apartment for you. You want, you can have it. And we moved in. But the first thing my husband bought was a radio. A white radio. Plugged in the radio. I hear they speak Yiddish.
Very nice.
That was my life.
Very nice.
Ja, fine.
Everything is meant to be right.
She's always right. I grew up in Brooklyn in the late 50s and early 60s when almost everyone seemed to have turned their back on Yiddish. Nothing could be less cool, especially to a music-obsessed kid like me. When I was in my teens, I got into old-time mountain music. And pretty soon, I trekked down to Appalachia to learn from the masters. I was living with and studying fiddle and banjo music of North Carolina with this great old fiddle player named Tommy Jarrell. And Tommy was puzzled that a lot of the people who came down to study music were Jewish. And he said to me one day, he said, Hank, don't your people got none of your own music? And it got me thinking, yeah, maybe there are the Yiddish equivalents of Tommy Jarrell. And I found out that there were. I started to collect klezmer, that's traditional Yiddish dance music, on old 78 RPM records. And I set up the first ever Yiddish sound archives at the YIVO Institute, the world's biggest Yiddish research center. It's based here in New York. The word got out. People would bring these records like they were abandoned children, and this was like some orphanage that they said, oh, this is where they're going to take care of these things. So I would just tell them, yeah, bring me more. Pretty soon there was a whole klezmer revival, and there were hundreds of klezmer bands across the country playing this music. It was amazing. A couple of years later, I discovered my first stack of radio discs, and it changed my life.
many soup do we have?
There's nothing.
Here we are in the epicenter of sound. This is Andy Lancett's lab where the preservation of the Yiddish radio discs happen.
Why? Why?
This is the disc. You get a sense it's made out of aluminum.
This particular disc came out of a dumpster in Lower Manhattan. Obviously, it didn't weather very well.
For the past 10 years, Andy Lancett's been working his magic restoring these things.
They're generally referred to as acetates. I mean, to be more precise, it's castor oil plasticized nitrocellulose lacquer. But what happens is that the
acetates were not meant for repeated plays, unlike commercial discs. They were very delicate and were meant to keep a record of the shows that were on the air in case a complaint was made by a listener, and then the Federal Radio Commission, later the Federal Communications Commission, could hear it.
And in English. And in English.
Having collected old 78 records for years, I was used to a kind of rehearsed perfection. But putting on these radio shows, they were just real.
Williamsburg, Brooklyn.
Here was something that was completely unself-conscious. Everything was take one. It's like a transmission from another planet, and it's taken light years to get to us.
Their telephone, triangle 52729.
It's like you're back in 1940, sitting there with this old man listening to the radio in his bathrobe.
Schmalzherring, homemade pickled herring, herring fillet in wine sauce, pickles, Sauerkraut, mayonnaise, applesauce, apple juice.
So this is where it started. We're here on the Lower East Side of Manhattan on Christie and Delancey. Back in 1926, this wasn't the park that it is now. It was the site of the Libby Hotel, home of the first Yiddish radio broadcast, the Libby Hotel program.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are now tuned in to...
And within months, there were Yiddish radio shows on small power stations throughout the New York area. On stations like WBBC, the Brooklyn Broadcasting Company.
WBBC, Brooklyn, New York.
WARD.
This is Ward, WARD.
WVFW.
You are now tuned in to station WVFW, the radio voice of the veterans of foreign wars.
They were going to lose their license, and I think they changed the letters so that they could seem more patriotic. Most of these were infinitesimal. They were tiny, tiny stations. You could only hear them from within the neighborhood they were broadcasting from.
WCNW, operating on a frequency of 1,500 kilocycles.
WCNW had like 50 watts of power. You couldn't even hear it in the studio. But the most famous Yiddish station of all was WEVD. Probably the first listener-supported station in history. It was created in 1926 by the Socialist Party to honor their recently deceased leader, Eugene Victor Debs. And it was taken over in 1932 by the Forward, the Yiddish socialist paper in New York. WEVD was home to the most renowned Yiddish show of all time, the Forward Hour, a lavish variety show that featured everything from extravagant musical numbers to the news performed in rhyme. Everyone listened. Everyone. Ironically, even though we have found hours and hours of some totally obscure Yiddish radio programs that no one ever heard of, only a couple of minutes of the old Forward Hour exist. One of the very few shards that survives is the show's closing theme song, a medley of revolutionary anthems from the Internationale to the Marseillaise. And that's just about all we've got.
Another Forward Hour comes to you next Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. WEVD, New York.
Sloan's Liniment, your faithful friend when muscles ache and pain, presents Gangbusters.
Mainstream radio was about escapism. You turn on the radio and you would have The Lone Ranger or Gangbusters. You would have these shows that were exotic and escapist with these like really larger-than-life characters. Yiddish radio, no one was larger than life. Everyone was life. It was a one-to-one ratio between the listener and the characters on the radio.
How's Mama?
Don't bother her. She has a headache.
I won't bother her. I'll only say hello.
They wanted a mirror. They didn't want a window to look out into another world. They wanted a mirror to see their own world.
I met Shirley, Phil's sister. They arrested him too, and she says they're going to send him to reform school.
If you were a listener to Yiddish radio and you turned your radio dial a quarter-inch to the left or a quarter-inch to the right, you would have experienced a completely different universe.
Why are you making so much noise, Papa? So early in the morning. Early in the morning?
Jews who were portrayed on mainstream radio were totally different than anything people would have encountered in their real lives. You had characters like Mrs. Pansy Nussbaum on the Fred Allen Show.
No? Oh, Mrs. Nussbaum. You were expecting maybe Emperor Shapiro Hito?
Mr. Kitzel on Jack Benny.
Say, Mr. Kitzel, what are you getting your wife for Christmas?
I got it already here in this box. It's a beautiful fur coat.
What is it, a fox or sable?
On the label, it's sable. In the box, it's fox.
There were a few exceptions, like the Goldbergs.
That's Molly Goldberg, folks.
A show written by a woman named Gertrude Berg who wanted to portray her own life.
You ready, darling?
Does Mike, you know?
You don't know? How could you know, Jack?
But for the most part, it was all stereotypes.
Hey, Mary, isn't it good to see Schlepperville again?
Yeah, but I wish he'd take that herring out of his hand while he's broadcasting.
And now, ladies and gentlemen.
It's Yiddish swing time. It's always springtime. Every Sunday at 1.
The golden age of Yiddish radio lasted from the 1930s to the 1950s. The people who created these magnificent programs, some of the best and most daring radio ever broadcast, have been largely completely forgotten. Like C. Israel Lutsky, the combative, obnoxious radio host who was the first advice columnist of the air. Carl Reiner does the voiceover.
You, my dear friend, with your own blind monkey love, are responsible for your own son's situation. If you want
and there was Nuchem Stuchkov, the brilliant linguist who wrote some of the finest dramas ever on radio. Here, he introduces one of his own plays. Stuchkov is portrayed by Eli Wallach.
Wir bringen noch eine kleine Geschichte von der Serie bei Tata Mama's Speech.
We bring you a new episode of Round the Family Table, an episode which takes place in New York but could have happened anywhere. In Philadelphia, Chicago, or anywhere where Jews live.
The
scene.
We've rescued goofy material like tons and tons of commercials.
Long and Isle singing, Zone is clinging. It's inside Gluckster's restaurant and caterers.
And serious programs like Reunion, where Holocaust survivors were reunited on the air.
And all this time, you haven't seen your father.
No, sir.
We want you to turn around, see if you know him. Ladies and gentlemen, that's really a touching scene. The father and son they've got each other in their arms. Tears of joy are going down their cheeks. And believe me, gentlemen and ladies that are listening to me now, I have never seen such a touching scene in all my life. Ladies and gentlemen, they stand together there in each other's arms. The emotion of the moment is really too much for them.
Yiddish radio and Yiddish culture went into a free fall after World War II. Almost all of the Yiddish speakers in Europe were murdered during the Holocaust. And when it was formed in 1948, the State of Israel turned its back on Yiddish in favor of Hebrew. In the United States, Yiddish radio fell victim to the successful assimilation of Jews into American culture and the rise of television. But there were a few holdouts, like Ben Gehling in Boston.
Ladies and gentlemen.
The earliest surviving recording of a Yiddish program we have is his from 1933, and he stayed on the air until 1999 when he died at the age of 100, making him the longest-running host in radio history.
If you wish to fill up your belly with gourmet food and the best of Delhi.
Ben Gehling loved to tell the story of his favorite guest, a violinist named Percy Brand, who came on his show shortly after he was released from Buchenwald.
I began interviewing him. He cried and I cried. And I said, well, let your fiddle talk. And it spoke to the hearts of people then, and even now after his death, Percy Braun, his name will never be forgotten.
Today, the last of the old-time East European native Yiddish speakers are dying off. For all intents and purposes, these recordings are our last visceral link back to a vibrant Yiddish culture.
No! Mrs. Lefkovich! You got Mrs. Wasser, Mrs. Lefkovich. What's the matter, Mama?
I think part of the thing in Jewish life is you want a kaddish. You want someone who's going to say the prayer for the dead for you after you're gone. And we're giving a kind of a kaddish. We're remembering these people, and we're honoring them, and we're keeping their names fresh and their memories alive.
Mrs. Levine.
My name is Miss Portnoy.
Mrs. Miriam Stein.
Their work still has great power. Their gift still has something to share with a whole new generation of listeners. And it melts away all of the intervening years.
Would you give her the $6 in current
imagine
payments?
what's happening to my heart all the
answer
time.
My question,
my mother's
sir.
staying away for a year. She only lives around the corner.
We heard you.
Listening to these voices not only allows us to remember these people, but just for a brief moment allows them to be with us again, to be a part of us, to live again.
This concludes our Yiddish evening program for tonight. We leave here now to return again tomorrow afternoon at 1:30. Until then, good night.
Almost 70 years ago, a rabbi named Shmuel Aaron Rubin began recording the proceedings of his traditional mediation court. It was a continuation of a centuries-old Eastern European practice in which learned men would settle community disputes without involving outside authorities. Realizing that New World technology was the best way to spread Old World values, Rubin started the weekly radio show, the Jewish American Board for Peace and Justice, and one of the first Courts of the Air was born. Discovered outside a home for aged rabbis on New York's Lower East Side in 1997, the recordings of Rabbi Rubin's court were rescued just before they were going to be carted off to the dump. Now they offer an unparalleled opportunity to listen in on the voices, lives, and conflicts of ordinary Jewish immigrants more than half a century ago. Our story is told by Rubin's son, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Rubin.
Und jetzt case number 8662.
That's me, more than 50 years ago, announcing a case overseen by my father, Rabbi Shmuel Aaron Rubin of blessed memory. My father was a kind and wise man who felt that everyone, rich and poor, deserved justice. So on certain Sundays, he'd open the doors to his Society for Retired Rabbis and invite the community in to help settle their disputes. In the late 1930s, he began recording these cases and broadcasting them on the radio for people to learn from.
It seems that my wife suffers from hallucinations, grand hallucinations, whereby she figures that I'm always telling her lies.
My father held court in a room at the back of the society. He'd sit at a table behind a microphone, concentrating on the case at hand. On either side, a panel of distinguished community members assisting him and asking questions in English.
Exactly what is it that you're complaining about besides what you told us about his lying?
Well, sometimes he used to come home 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning.
You objected to that?
And, yes,
and were there numerous quarrels?
Yes, there was.
Disputes?
Yes.
And those are the things that you can't stand.
That's right, yes.
All right.
Today, it seems like you can't turn on the TV without seeing a court case. But back in the 1940s, a show like this was completely different, and the participants seemed almost to forget that they were on the air.
He was telling me, I love you very much. If you don't marry me, I'm going to have a hemorrhage. Since I am married, I have never seen peace in my home.
My father presided over hundreds of cases, many of them involving wives and husbands.
That woman absolutely didn't want to do nothing for me. And of course she misled me, and then she threw me out of the house again. And if a woman throws me out of the house, I have no confidence in such people.
But over the years, my father's court settled every kind of dispute you could imagine, between salesmen and customers,
What is basically wrong with this machine?
Certainly, I certainly will answer that question. Immediately.
Between dentists and patients.
She claims I pulled two. I only pulled one tooth out. A lower right cuspid, and I have it in my pocket, and there's an upper right molar, and I
between undertakers and the bereaved.
You know that 12 plots were purchased.
What'd you say?
You know that 12 plots were purchased 23 years ago.
I was what?
You know that 12 plots were purchased 23 years ago. Is that right?
I do not. I beg your pardon.
Just a minute.
My record is clear.
Nobody is...
I'm frank to tell you I know nothing. The records were all there.
Rabbi Rubin?
Things could get heated in my father's court, but he'd never lose his composure. He'd just sit there, a kind look on his face, leaving it to his associates to interrogate the aggrieved parties. Let's listen to State Senator Bernard Austin questioning an unscrupulous father.
What's the most important thing in your life, money or your happiness?
Happiness.
What happiness did you give this boy?
I gave the boy the happiness all he wants.
How often have you seen him?
I saw the boy whenever I had a chance.
How often is that? How long has he been away from you?
I saw him maybe twice.
The mere fact that you just gave him a few dollars every now and then, or the $10 a week, that isn't happiness to a child. Wait a minute, just a minute. Now we're getting back to this lady.
Yeah.
What have you done to make her life happy to live with you?
Year. I supported her.
What is it that you want now?
I don't want nothing. She isn't for me, and I'm not for her. If a woman could put me in business and then later make
Excuse
me
me, just a moment.
Yes?
You're bringing up a very touchy thing.
I'm
you
not
marry
touchy.
a woman for a woman to put you into business.
I told her before.
Wait a minute. You're only looking for the standpoint of your own good.
No, I ain't.
Because you married her, as you just said.
Yeah?
That you married her so that she could put you into business.
What do you expect me to do? Carry 100 pounds of dry goods on my shoulder?
For all of this, our engineer, Mr. Rosenblatt, would sit in the corner of the room, cutting a 16-inch disc of the proceedings for the radio broadcast. When a 15-minute side was finished, we'd pause while Mr. Rosenblatt put on a new disc. After the arguments and deliberations were complete, it was time for the decision. Hal Linden is the voice of my father, in this case, involving a daughter who didn't want to care for her 83-year-old mother. The court ruled in favor of the old woman.
I envy you the great good deed you are about to do, taking your blind, elderly mother home with you. And we appeal through our radio waves to your neighbors. Maybe you have 18 of them, and 3/4 of them listen to our radio waves. So those neighbors, they should help you so that your mother will never go without food and never want for a cup of warm water. You'll take your mother with you, and that's what is best. Go in good health, go home and take pride in the good deed you have done, and may God bless you for your kind act.
My father's organization for retired rabbis, the House of Sages, still exists on the Lower East Side. Here, old men study Torah and pray. For more than 45 years, the society has been run by my brother-in-law, Rabbi Kalman Gershon Newman, who also continued my father's weekly radio broadcasts.
This was an arbitration court. And once you signed up, the decision was binding.
My father used to tell my brother-in-law that presiding over the court was one of his most significant achievements.
Rabbi Rubin, may rest in peace, it was more important to him than the organization itself, because, learning Torah, very important, but to be able to bring peace in families, among families, the rabbi always thought that this is his major accomplishment.
Let's take a few minutes to listen to my father help bring peace to a family. The case takes place sometime in the 1940s. A mother has brought her son to court. She's upset because her son promised to give her $6 a week and stopped. He's upset because his mother is mean to his wife. My father's colleague, Bernard Austin, opens the questioning.
Are you the son of this lady?
Yes.
And did you promise to help her financially?
Yes, I did.
Did you live up to your promise?
I did until some time ago.
How long ago?
Exactly a year ago.
Your intentions were to give her $6 a week.
Yes.
And why did you stop contributing that amount?
Well, I don't want to hurt my mother. I have one mother. But I have a wife and 3 children.
But you hurt her by not giving her support.
Yes, but you see, my mother has been saying not too good things about my wife. My wife has feel very bad. I never see my mother. I fear as if there's no mother to me. I don't like to give money to somebody. And meanwhile, she never comes around to visit my family.
All right, one moment, please.
And she lives around the corner.
Excuse me.
At this point, my father steps in.
Do you speak Yiddish?
A little, yeah.
I want to ask you a question. We know you're a good child. Every child wants to help his mother. What's keeping you from that? Tell us the truth. I know there's a good reason that you're not giving her the money. Is it because of your wife?
No, not my wife. No,
So why don't you help your mother?
Well, I'll tell you. It's like this. Money is something. You understand? To help. But it isn't everything. That's the way I felt about it. Here my mother come to my child's bris. She lived around the corner. Why? Because she has a feeling towards my wife, which if I give her $6 a week, it wouldn't help any.
You want your mother to come to your house and help your wife with the children?
Not to help her, but to say hello, see how the children get along.
Your mother is angry at your wife.
And she's rotten, I'm in the middle. And if I give her, it seems to encourage her not to stay away from my house.
Tell me,
We're not Austin again.
does your mother have another source of livelihood?
I don't know. That's why I get here.
As an honest man, you know that your mother depended upon these $6 a week that you gave her.
She did.
And there's no moral justification why you shouldn't give your mother the $6 that you promised her.
There's no moral justification for the $6, but don't you see? I see by her giving $6, she stays more away from the house. She doesn't come and visit my family. If I do meet her on the street occasionally, I feel bad. It's like a rupture in my heart. I go to work and know that something isn't wholesome. Everything isn't right. So I stopped. Yes, I stopped. I had to do something.
Would you welcome your mother to visit your home?
Surely, after all, I'm her son. And I'd like her to say good things about my wife.
Would you give her the $6 in
But
current
imagine what's
payments?
happening to my heart
Just
all the
answer
time.
my question,
My
sir.
mother's staying away for a year and she'll
we
live
heard
around the
you.
corner.
We heard you. Would you want to make current payment of $6 every week, beginning from today on?
Surely.
You would.
As a matter of fact,
And would you give her the differential of the $300 which accumulated for the year that you didn't give her any
Surely.
money?
Don't
and
worry.
what do you ask from her in return?
Don't worry. I didn't spend that money. I saved it.
What do
but
you
after
ask?
all, she's a mother to me.
Fine.
I want
What
to
do
see
you-
me and the children.
All right,
God
one
forbid.
moment, please.
I want to give her security.
The
After I'll
judges-
see how her husband treated her.
One moment, please. And jetzt um
I turn to the mother and ask what she has to say.
I have good children, but my daughter-in-law, I go to her house and she shouts at me. She calls me on the phone and says, "Mom, come over," and when I get there, she accuses me of beating my son. She says I smacked him left and right.
Smacked him left and right.
My daughter-in-law, she doesn't even act like a Jew. How can I stand for that? Oh, how I have suffered. She's always insulting me. I told her how important her husband was to me, and she said, "Go get your own husband." And about her husband, she says, "I smacked him."
I smacked him.
Entschuldigt.
I tell the woman she must stop.
Wir haben the decision von
The court deliberates. And then my father announces the decision.
Ja, richtig.
Yes, quite a case.
A case, sehr ein ernster case.
Quite a serious case.
Ich muss da ermahnen.
A case predicated on a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Here sits a mother who is terribly angry at her children. But she forgets that her son is a son and her daughter-in-law is a daughter. I think she feels that the son is a son and the daughter-in-law is no more than some young woman who stole her son away. So there she sits in anger. It states in the Torah that elders should not encourage disrespect in their children. If this woman is disrespectful of her children and her grandchildren see this, that is not a good thing. Money she wants from her son, but when it comes to going to his home, she refuses to go. That is why this case is a very important one. And in this case, we sympathize with the son, and we side with him and his wife. Mrs., you are the wife of a good son, but the daughter-in-law of a difficult mother-in-law. We have neither the time nor strength to convince your mother-in-law that she must change. You must keep your home open to your mother-in-law and do what you can for her. And I am sure that when you do good deeds on your mother-in-law's behalf, she will reciprocate. Mister, give the money to your mother, and we beseech your mother to respect you and to stop ignoring your wife and your dear little children. We will send our ladies' auxiliary to your house in the next few weeks to make sure that this matter has been resolved and that you have peace in your home.
And then I conclude the broadcast by saying, a heartfelt thanks to you, Rabbi Rubin, for your wise decision. My father, Rabbi Shmuel Aaron Rubin, of blessed memory, presided over the Jewish Court for Peace and Justice until his death in 1957. I am Rabbi Menachem Mendel Rubin.
This is Jewish American Board for Peace and Justice in New York.
For parties, late snacks, dinners, be rational, serve meats made by Hebrew National. Good time, old time flavor, every time Hebrew National meats.
You'll say thanks for our franks, our pastrami and salami.
Hebrew National meats for you.
Chunky Milk Chocolate presents the Chunky Theater of the Year.
And now, something a little different for a longtime public radio broadcaster like me. Commercials. Nothing but commercials.
Chunky, Chunky.
The radio stations that carried Yiddish language broadcasts in the 1930s and 1940s devoted a lot of time to advertising. That's how they paid the bills.
For that old-fashioned flavor that all the folks favor, try Hebrew National meats. They're a treat.
This holiday, buy gefilte fish in gleaming glass jars.
Delicately light, always right.
Cheese blintzes, apple, cherry, blueberry, and strawberry. Dumplings and potato latkes too.
Sometimes inspired, sometimes inept. Commercials made for many of the more memorable moments on Yiddish radio, as we learn in this whirlwind tour from Henry Sapoznik.
Long and Isle singing, those dinners clinging. It's inside Gluckster's Restaurant and Caterers.
And now a word from our sponsor. The 7 most hated words in the history of broadcasting. But quirky commercials from little neighborhood stores were the lifeblood of Yiddish radio. And just like archaeologists, when they want to learn about the lives of common people, they're not going to find out about it by excavating palaces or temples. They're going to go to the poor part of town and dig up garbage dumps. And in essence, that's what these commercials do for us. They tell us about where people were eating.
In Parkway Cafeteria. In Parkway Cafeteria.
What they were eating.
Schmalzherring, homemade pickled herring, herring fillet in wine sauce, pickles, Sauerkraut, grain, applesauce.
What they were drinking.
Shapiro's kosher wine.
Shapiro's wine, den Fleischlauf in den Börsen, ist dicke fein, als wir kennen schneiden mit am Börsen.
They tell us about the products people were using around the house.
Brillo kosher soap. The Star of David is worked right through the soap. It never disappears. Brillo kosher soap.
These commercials tell us about what people were wearing.
Old Man Adler is the man to see when you want to be taller than she.
Because Old Man Adler does a lot for you.
Confidentially with his elevator shoe.
Even their wacky ideas, like advertisements on radio station WEVD for something called home diathermy.
Call now, yes, immediately.
People would sit for hours and hours in front of some specially rigged radio, soaking up its waves. It was supposed to cure everything.
Painful arthritis or neuritis, bursitis, neuralgia, lumbago, sciatica, sinus trouble, rheumatism, tonsillitis, laryngitis, bronchitis, cystitis, prostatitis, bronchial asthma, or pleurisy. I thank you.
Restaurant, das ist bekannt. Moskowitz and Lufowitz. In New York, in Nibelungland. Moskowitz and Lufowitz.
Der Telefon von der Moskowitz und Lufowitz kosher Restaurant ist Oregon 4 03 62.
But that voice is perhaps the most infamous in the history of Yiddish radio. Mitchell Levitsky, the advertising king, endowed with a sense of phrasing, pacing, and delivery which may be unique in the history of American broadcasting. Every word was a new challenge for Mitchell Levitsky. Listen.
How is your imagination? Picture a pear. It will taste as good as it looks. Simply wonderful. S&W pears at all fine groceries and supermarkets.
Levitsky was a brilliant ad salesman with a less than brilliant on-air presence. When he spoke English, it sounded like Yiddish was his first language, and when he spoke Yiddish, it sounded like English was his first language.
Ihre Blouses und Playkloths, dip and dry,
dip and drive.
Levitsky came to WEVD in the early 1940s. Unlike other on-air personalities who were actors or writers or poets, Levitsky's skill was selling advertising, which he was then allowed to read on the air.
This is a thought that usually gets pushed aside by the thought of the fuss and bother and time that goes into good stuffed cabbage.
Levitsky was so good at snaring little neighborhood businesses that he became one of the most ubiquitous voices in Yiddish radio. This is Jerry Stiller as Mitchell Levitsky in an ad for the Crown Hotel.
Dear friends,
you're now listening to the Crown Hotel program. The hotel which was recently built, recently refurbished. Here you will find rooms with private baths and carpets and wall-to-wall telephones in every room, strictly kosher, and synagogue and a rabbi and cantor in residence, newly remodeled lobby.
He was unstoppable in terms of tracking down advertisers. I mean, if there was a local store that he set his sights on, they were going to advertise on WEVD whether they liked it or not. You know, Levitsky comes back, I got him! Waving the papers, with the contract for 2 weeks of ads from Portnoy's Trusses.
And now, good news from Portnoy.
Are you herniated?
Go to Portnoy.
Go to Portnoy.
Portnoy.
See Portnoy and stop worrying from a rupture. Portnoy, new patented Wonder Trust, ends hernia trouble and eases your discomfort. Hear what a long-time sufferer has said. I suffered from a rupture for 15 years, but now, thanks to Portnoy's, my hernia worries are over. Portnoy's is New York's largest trust store. Take my advice, go to Portnoy and stop your suffering from rupture. Portnoy, 53 Delancey Street, Delancey, corner Eldridge Street, New York.
Corner Eldridge Street, New York.
Go now to Portnoy. Remember, Portnoy.
If Mitchell Levitsky was the most famous advertising voice on Yiddish radio, then the most famous commercial by far was a little jingle written for a low-rent clothing store named Joe and Paul. Joe and Paul was opened in 1912 by a man named Paul Kovsky. There never actually was a Joe. Apparently, someone had told Kovsky that people would trust him more if they thought he had a partner. In the 1930s, Paul Kovsky asked composer Sholem Secunda, the man who wrote by Mir Bistushain, to write a jingle for his store. Secunda played the piano and Paul sang it himself. This is the first time that this commercial has been broadcast in more than half a century.
Joe en Paul, a store vaar knieken, brabberilla Joe en Paul, dat weet je bully kriegen, brabberilla zoet, a koud, a gieten zolle perfect, a feten daftje, kuiven, nor bij Joe en Paul.
Joe and Paul, a store of pleasure. Joe and Paul, you'll find a bargain there. A suit, a coat, everything's perfect. I tell you, you have to shop at Joe and Paul. And that was it. Short, to the point, and permanently implanted in the consciousness of listeners to Yiddish radio who heard the jingle again and again and again. One of these listeners was a young comedian named Aaron Schwat, later known as Red Buttons.
Well, we used to hang around the cafeterias in the 30s. It was Kellogg's Cafeteria on 49th Street. It was a cafeteria for the small-time guys. So we'd sit around the table, Jewish kids, we were first-generation Americans, and we fell in love with Joe and Paul Safaganagin. Number one, it was funny. Number two was musical, and it was catchy. It was a very, very catchy refrain. Joe, Paul Safag. I mean, there was something about it that had a little chen, had a little heart to it. So we used to tap it off on the tables, yum, bum, bum, ba, ba, yum, bum, bum. And I just started to play around with it, and it caught on immediately.
Red Buttons had worked up a parody of the Joe and Paul commercial and Yiddish radio in general, which he took up with him to the Jewish resorts in the Catskills. His audience loved it. But it was wartime. When Buttons got called up into the service, a young vaudeville duo named the Barton Brothers appropriated his skit and then recorded it for the fledgling Apollo label.
WBVD. Hey, Baba Reba,
Eddie Barton is the surviving Barton brother.
We recorded it, and we got $250, and we ran out of town. We thought we stole $250.
I send me sister.
The song, however, became a hit. A big, big, big hit.
We're out of town about 5 or 6 months, and I get a call from the agent. He says, listen, what are you doing out of town? He says, we've sold about 750,000 records. I said, you've sold 750,000 of what records? He says, the records you made.
Joe
and Paul, a pleasure. Joe and Paul, you can find a bargain. Bring in your young son.
What speech?
And then you would hear my brother talk.
Good
Good morning, dear radio listeners, to the Joe and Paul clothing stores. If you have a bar mitzvah boy who needs a slack suit, a two-tone, a reversible slicker, a herringbone, a Miami Charvette, a Bronx Sharpie, a Brooklyn Droop, bring them in. We played Carnegie Hall. We were at Madison Square Garden with 40,000 people sitting out in the audience, and we got a standing ovation. We killed it. They got such a big kick out of it.
What speech?
Mothers, do you have a young boy about 14, 15 years old who likes to go to burlesque shows? He's already buying French postcards. He comes home, he goes in the bathroom, he closes the door behind him, and you hear... Mothers, do yourself a favor, do him a favor. Give that boy a couple of bucks and send him to Cockeye Jenny. And if you don't know where it is, ask your husband. He's been a satisfied customer for years.
And that's commercials on Yiddish radio. We now return you to your regularly scheduled program.
That's all.
Und darf sein, du in Studien sehen in der Mama mit den Blumen, alle Gäste. Und darf sehen, was für ein Freit, was für ein Jonte. A happy birthday to you, Bine Abramovich.